Welcome everybody to our daily lockdown lectures as we think about preparing ourselves for mission in the world once we're allowed to go out into that world once again. Today we're going to look at the first part of our tour through the Bible as we try and track down what this concept of mission is and how important it is to us. And so we're looking at Genesis and the genesis of mission. I've divided this lecture into two to make it more manageable for everybody. And I'd like, just before we launch into that, to go back to what I discussed yesterday, my of mission, which is God sending his people, through his people, to cross barriers between people, to bring about his purposes in the world. Let's see how this works out as we look at the material of the earliest chapters of Genesis. Now, there are many sources for this in the Bible, and the basic dimensions of mission are derived from Genesis itself, rather than some sort of artificial construct. And as we look at the subject, perhaps we can consider these references, keep them in mind. You can go back and look at them. Excuse me, still working on the technicalities. Genesis 1 to 4, Romans 8, Colossians 1, Hebrews chapter 1, and John chapter 1. And but for today we will mainly focus on in Genesis chapters 1 to 4. It's interesting to note that God is interested in his universe. Not all deities in all traditions are actually interested in the world. But the basic dimensions for us as Christian believers, the basic dimensions of God also constitute the basic dimensions of mission. And we'll see how that works out. God has a universe-sized mission. God doesn't think small in any way. God is great beyond imagining. He is, and his intentions for the whole of creation, and those intentions constitute his mission, his purpose, as we looked at the idea of mission yesterday. And people are part of that universe. And being part of the universe, part of that whole intricate plan of God's, means that we have a part in the mission of God. Now, there are two issues that I'd like to look at here today. And the one is ruling, and the one is relationship. Our unchanged and unchanging mission basis is that we are designated by God to rule. And we need to think carefully about this concept, because it has been abused in many ways down the ages. Let's look at the relevant passage in Genesis 1:26 and 28. Let us make humankind, God says, in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. And then in verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now this constitutes our first mandate as human beings. And I suggest that it hasn't changed. It hasn't gone away just because things have changed. We'll look at the change and what that brings about in God's mission. But the entire human race has a purpose as rulers of God's creation. Because what you're there for is your purpose. And your purpose is that for which we have been sent. And it's an interesting thing to note that mission means being sent. And Genesis shows God putting human beings, humankind, into a position, sending human beings as his vice-regents on earth, his tenants in his vineyard, as Jesus will refer to them later. Now, ruling can be a bad thing. All of us can think rulers, the oppression and plundering and terrible things that rulers do to their people. But that's not where we learn rulership from. We learn how to rule from the one who rules, from God. And every aspect of the way in which we handle ourselves and our communities, our world, the situations that we find ourselves in, conditioned by the way in which God rules. And we see that God's rule is comprehensive. It's over everything, everywhere. It doesn't pick and choose. It doesn't leave some things to be outside of his interest. The whole universe is God's concern. The whole earth should be ours. God is creative. God creates the world in that beautiful song of creation. We read and realize how intricate and wonderful and orderly the whole of God's creation is intended to be. And in the same way, we read in the creation passages in Genesis that people are intended to subdue, to bring out of unruliness into order, to receive the animals from God. And of course, we're to be creative in the sense of being procreative as well, filling the earth and bringing it into the same order as the garden. So God's comprehensive, he's creative, he's also caring. He tends to human beings' needs. And he expects human beings to tend to take care of the garden and to name the animals, to know them each by name. There's something very caring about that. And God's rule is cooperative. Let us make humankind in our image. There's cooperation right from the start within the Godhead. And God is concerned that Adam shouldn't be alone. He needs a helper. And human beings are to be in this ruling capacity or role together. But we'll look at that more later. So dimensions of God's ruling define our dimensions of our ruling. And I'm going to switch over to slides here. Ruling is, the ruling we're supposed to do is, first of all, comprehensive, involving everything, everywhere. Why do scientists try and unlock the secrets of the Antarctic? Not because they are necessarily greedy for gain, but because our human interest is supposed to extend to everywhere on the earth. Ruling involves finding and creating. It involves making something that was less than optimal work better. To make something that was ugly look beautiful. It is changing things for the better. That's what creativity is. Finding unique solutions. And then we're to have hands-on labor to tend God's creation. Onions do not harvest themselves. And ruling means discovering and naming God's creation. A scientist who isolates a germ or a virus and names it is then en route to controlling it. And that's what we are praying for with those who are chasing down the secrets of COVID-19. And we trust that in due course, through creativity and care, humankind will be able to find a cure for this current scourge. And then ruling involves all races, both genders, all ages, God and all humanity. It's very important that we gain a picture of mission from these early chapters that tells us the truth about who we are and the world we live in. And I'd like us to look at this picture and think about what it shows us about these aspects of mission. Right. Will I zoom in a little? No, can't zoom. What we have here is a rhinoceros that has been sedated. I'm sure no one just told it to sit and it sat. We've got a couple of vets. One of them's poking around in the ear of the towel draped over its eyes. We've got a couple of armed guards looking jumpy with automatic rifles over their shoulders. This shows us humanity at its best, in a sense, in carrying out this Genesis mandate, this Genesis mission. It's comprehensive because it's gone to a distant place and found a strange creature, the rhino. It's not considered this animal to be beyond its mandate. It's both genders. I see a man and a woman there. It's at least a couple of different race and culture groups there. Different specialities. I see armed soldiers. I see medically trained personnel. I don't know who else is needed there. A tracker. And that's a good example of how this mandate works. We don't notice it, but it is nevertheless still there. And deep in our psyche as human beings, we know that this is the sort of thing that we should be involved in. And we know that because we were created in the image of our Creator, who has all those things. Which leads us into the third point, and that is relationship. Our unchanged way of doing mission is through relationship. This cooperation is not just strategic, it's actually essential. And if we live without relationships, then we are not living as full human beings. And we are beginning to value that in these days of isolation, aren't we? Well, people are first of all created to know and love God. That's the first great relationship. Speaking, walking, serving, obeying. It comes out in the story in very lovely ways. We're also in relationship with our environment. We to rule over the earth. Remember that phrase? As well as all the creatures that move on it. There's a sense in which we, as creatures of the earth, are responsible for the earth from which we are formed. And that's very important. And a lot of what's gone wrong with the world has been through losing the sense of God's mandate to take care of all his creation. And of course, it goes without saying, but it needs to be said, because sometimes we don't give it its due value, that people are created to be in relationship with each other. And we need to note that community nature of people reflects God's communal nature. But that's a subject for another day. And so all in all, if we're talking about mission involves hard work. And it'll take strength and endurance. Right. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that my silly pictures help as well. The African Study Bible has an interesting quote, which I'd like to take us to here. The Bible raises men and women to a status above all other created works. Only humans are given authority and responsibility for one another, the animals and the environment. Being made in God's image means that the Creator has given each of us the creative potential to innovate and impact our environment. Everyone has something special to offer the world. Isn't that lovely? I'd like to move into a reflection here and a suggested exercise that I think you might find quite helpful. Certainly I find this sort of thing helpful. What sort of mission do you have in life? With all this talk of the scope of God's mission, what rings a bell? What are you involved in terms of God's mission in the world? What would you like to be involved in? Reflect on that as you reflect on what I've had to say in this lecture. So now, let's think out of the box once again. Mission is God's sending. We see this through this passage that we've looked at. God's sending through creation and placement, his people, Adam and Eve, and through them, of course, all humanity, through his people, in cooperation with each other, to cross barriers of wild and tame, barriers of species, geographical barriers, fill the earth, he says. Barriers between people isn't applicable just yet. We'll deal with that tomorrow. But to bring about God's purposes in the world. And God's purposes, we find, are order, good relationships, creative work, discovery, and uninterrupted communion with God. These are things that are worthwhile having and worthwhile working for. A life spent in any of those pursuits will bring us great satisfaction and make the world a better place. Let's pray together. Creator Spirit, mighty God, help us to look back through the eons and see you as you first showed yourself to humans. Help us to regain the vision of your intentions for your world and reclaim that as our mandate and mission. Amen.